Personalized medicine. What can one expect in the coming years from the current revolution in genomics? First of all, the understanding of that tiny fraction, 0.1%, of the human DNA that differs from person to person has moved ahead rapidly and is likely in the next few years to reveal the most common genetic glitches that place individuals at risk for cancer, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, and many other conditions. It will allow each of us, if we're interested, to obtain a personal readout documenting our future risks of illness. Few of those reports will be as dramatic as in Susan's family, however, because few of us will have genetic glitches with such strong effects. Would you want to know? Many people would say yes, if interventions are available to reduce their risks, and in some instances, that is already possible. A person found to be at high genetic risk for colon cancer, for instance, can begin colonoscopy at an early age and repeat it faithfully once a year in order to detect the small polyps at a time when they can be readily removed, preventing an ultimate transformation into a deadly cancer. Individuals found to be at higher than average risk for diabetes can watch their diet carefully and avoid gaining weight. Individuals at high risk for blood clots in the legs can avoid birth control pills and prolonged periods of immobilization. In another powerful application of personalized medicine, it is increasingly clear that an individual's response to drugs is heavily influenced by heredity. It may be possible in many instances to predict who should be given which drug and at what dose by first testing a DNA sample from that person. This pharmacogenomics approach, applied widely, should result in increasingly effective drug therapy and fewer occurrences of dangerous or even fatal side effects. Ethical problems posed by DNA testing. The advances I have just described are all potentially valuable. Yet many ethical dilemmas have also been encountered. In Susan's family, a strong disagreement arose about whether it was appropriate to test children for the presence of a BRCA1 mutation. Since no medical intervention was available for children, and since the psychological impact of positive testing could be substantial, Dr. Weber and I, supported by a majority of ethical experts we consulted, concluded that such testing should be delayed until the individual reached the age of 18. In at least one instance, a father who carried the BRCA1 mutation became quite angry that his daughters could not be tested right then. He argued that his parental authority ought to trump our decision. A larger ethical debate has arisen over whether or not it is ever appropriate for third parties to have access to or to use genetic information about individuals. Susan and many of her relatives were fearful that if they tested positive, information might fall into the hands of their health insurance companies or their employers, and they might find themselves without medical coverage or a job. Extensive ethical analysis of this situation has led to the conclusion that such discriminatory use of genetic information would be a violation of principles of justice and fairness, since flaws in DNA are essentially universal and no one gets to pick his own DNA sequence. On the other hand, if insurance customers know their own risks, but insurers do not, then there is a risk that the customers will game the system. That could be a significant issue for large life insurance policies. It does not appear to play much of a role at all in health insurance. The weight of evidence suggests, therefore, that legislative protection ought to be provided against genetic discrimination in health insurance and the workplace. At this writing, however, we still await the implementation of effective legislation at the federal level in the United States. Failure to provide legal protection could have a profoundly negative effect on the future of individualized preventive medicine, since individuals may be frightened to obtain genetic information that otherwise could be quite useful to them. Another major ethical question that arises in these discussions, and rightfully so, is the issue of access to care. This is particularly vexing in the United States, where at this writing more than 40 million of its citizens lack health insurance coverage. Of all the developed nations in the world, we in the United States seem most able to turn our heads and look away from this failure of moral responsibility. one of the tragic consequences is relegating the impoverished to highly inefficient and inconsistent emergency room care. This does nothing for prevention, focusing mainly on the medical disasters when they inevitably occur. The access dilemma will become ever more acute as advances in research, particularly inspired by what we are learning about the genome, lead to new and much more effective means of prevention for cancer, heart disease, mental illness, and many other conditions. Bioethics rests on the foundation of the moral law. Before delving further into ethical dilemmas, it behooves us to consider the foundations upon which our judgments of ethical behavior are based. Many bioethical issues are complicated. Those debating the morality of a given decision may come from vastly different cultural backgrounds and religious traditions. In a secular and pluralistic society, is it realistic that any group could agree on the right course of action in difficult circumstances? Actually, I have found that once the facts of the matter are clear, in most instances, people with widely different worldviews can come to a comfortable and shared conclusion. While that may at first seem surprising, I believe that it is a compelling example of the universality of the moral law. We all have an innate knowledge of right and wrong. Although that can be obscured by distractions and misunderstandings, it can also be discovered through careful contemplation. T.L. Beauchamp and J.F. Childress argue that 4 ethical principles undergird much of bioethics and are common to virtually all cultures and societies. These include 1. Respect for autonomy, the principle that a rational individual should be given freedom in personal decision-making without undue outside coercion. 2. Justice, the requirement for fair, moral, and impartial treatment of all persons. 3. Beneficence, the mandate to treat others in their best interest. 4. Non-maleficence, first do no harm, as in the Hippocratic Oath. What role should faith play in bioethical debates? A religious person will see these as principles clearly laid out in sacred texts of the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, and other religious traditions. In fact, some of the most eloquent and powerful statements of these principles are to be found in such sacred texts. But one need not be a theist to agree to these principles. Even a person untrained in musical theory can be transported by a Mozart concerto. The moral law speaks to all of us, whether or not we agree on its origins. Basic principles of ethics can be derived from the moral law and are universal. But conflicts can arise in a situation where not all of the principles can be satisfied at the same time, and different observers attach different weights to the principles that must be somehow balanced. In many instances, society has reached a consensus on how to handle this. In other instances, such as the one we are about to consider next, reasonable people will disagree about the ethical balance sheet.